The cold metal bars rattled when the dog shifted, his body trembling though the room was still. The shelter smelled of bleach and wet fur, but beneath it lingered something heavier, the resignation of lives counting down to silence. His eyes, dim but pleading, followed each pair of footsteps that passed, flickering with hope, and then sinking again into the hollow of despair. A clipboard hung crookedly on his kennel door, a red slash across his name. Tomorrow morning, the final walk. No one had chosen him. In the corridor, fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, casting his thin frame in a washed-out glow. His ribs pressed like shadows against his skin. Every breath felt like it carried the weight of goodbye. He didn't whine anymore. He didn't bark. He simply lay there, a ghost still tethered to a body, and then the sound of boots stopping. A pause that seemed to stretch the air itself. A stranger crouched, lowering his gaze until it met the dog's broken eyes. For the first time in months, the silence cracked, not with noise, but with possibility. The world held its breath, and in that fragile stillness, the story began. The shelter was a place where time did not move forward. It only circled, looping endlessly in the clatter of feeding pans, the spray of hoses, the shuffle of shoes echoing across concrete. Days were measured not by light or weather, but by the rhythm of opening and closing doors. To the dog, the sun might have been a rumor, something he had once known but could no longer reach. The only certainty was the fluorescent glow above him, harsh and indifferent, humming as though mocking the fragile hearts below it. He lay curled on a thin blanket that smelled of bleach and damp fur. The blanket had been washed many times, but no amount of scrubbing could erase the scent of fear woven into its fibers. His body trembled though the air was not cold, his ribs jutting like the bones of a broken fence. Hunger was not new to him. It had become a language his body no longer resisted. What gnawed at him now was something quieter, something deeper. The kind of emptiness that hollowed out the eyes long before it hollowed out the body. Every hour, footsteps passed. Some were quick, purposeful strides belonging to workers who moved as if they carried too many invisible weights. Others were slower, accompanied by voices high with hope, low with debate, voices that sometimes paused in front of other kennels. He had learned the pattern, the bright tone of children, the cautious murmurs of parents, the rehearsed reassurances of staff. But those sounds rarely stopped in front of his cage. When they did, it was only for a heartbeat, a glance, a hesitation, then the shuffle away. He did not cry out anymore. He had once, in the early days, pressed his muzzle to the bars and let loose a trembling whimper, the kind of sound that begged not for attention but for mercy. But voices had passed, and hands had never reached. Slowly his spirit had folded inward, as if silence might protect him from the breaking that came with hope. Now he simply watched. His eyes, dark pools reflecting the sterile light, clung to each shadow as it moved, as if searching for something that would not leave him behind. On his kennel door, the clipboard hung like a final sentence. A red slash had been drawn across the page, bold, irreversible, cutting through the letters of his name. He did not know what the mark meant, but he felt it. Animals always feel the shift in air when death draws close. The workers were gentler now, their voices soft when they passed. One had even crouched by the bars last night, whispering, "I'm sorry," as though those words could ease the weight of inevitability. But apologies were not food, nor freedom, nor time. They were just sounds dissolving into the hum of the lights. Outside his cage, the world carried on. Dogs barked, some with frantic energy, others with voices breaking from overuse. A puppy in the next row yelped high-pitched cries, desperate for attention, and the sound drew people in like a magnet. He listened, not with jealousy, but with a quiet resignation, knowing the squeals of the young could pierce walls that his silence never could. Somewhere down the corridor, a staff member laughed, a brief burst of human warmth quickly swallowed by the sterile atmosphere. Life continued even as his dwindled. He shifted on the blanket, the metal floor beneath pressing into his bones. The smell of disinfectant stung his nose. In the corner, a bowl of water reflected the buzzing lights, untouched. He had no thirst. Hunger and thirst belonged to the living, to those who still believed in tomorrow. He existed now in a space between, not yet gone, not fully here, His breaths came shallow, each one echoing louder in his chest than it did in the room. He remembered fragments. A yard once filled with grass, the rough warmth of a hand, the rhythm of a voice speaking his name. Memories came not as stories, but as flickers, like old film reels burning at the edges. He could not hold them long. They slipped through the cracks of his weary mind. Still, they returned often enough to sting, proof that once, long ago, he had been more than a body in a cage. He had belonged to someone. He had mattered. Now he was a shadow among shadows. Dogs came and went, their cages emptied and filled again, the cycle repeating like the ticking of a hidden clock. He wondered, in whatever way dogs wonder, if he had been forgotten by mistake, left behind while others had been chosen. But then he would glance at the clipboard again, at the angry slash across his name, and the truth would settle back into his bones. Forgotten or not, his hours had been counted. As the evening fell, the lights dimmed slightly, though they never truly went out. Workers moved more slowly, their voices tired, their faces wary. A final sweep of the corridor, the locking of doors, the quieting of keys. The shelter grew still except for the restless sounds of the animals. He lay down again, curling tighter, listening to the breathing of those around him, quick, sharp, hopeful, terrified. His own breath was slower, almost invisible, a quiet tide receding into the dark. And yet, even in that stillness, something stirred within him. Not hope, not quite. It was more like the faint spark of instinct, the stubborn refusal of life to let go, even when everything else had. He closed his eyes, ears twitching at the sound of a distant door opening, the faint scrape of boots against the concrete floor. He did not know then that the sound was not routine, that those steps, steady and unhurried, carried with them a pause that would change the rhythm of his life. But for that night, he only curled tighter, the weight of the counted hours pressing down. Tomorrow, he would learn whether the world had forgotten him completely, or if, against every expectation, someone might still see him before time ran out. The morning began like any other inside the shelter. The metallic symphony of bowls being stacked, the sharp hiss of a hose, the uneven chorus of barks rising and falling like waves against a shore. Dust floated in narrow beams of light sneaking through high, grimy windows. Outside, the sky was washed in a grey pallor, a kind of muted morning that felt undecided, neither warm nor cold, neither alive nor dead. He did not know why he came. The stranger carried no leash, no collar, no list of breeds in mind. He had woken restless, as if his bones had whispered that something was missing. The weight of his own life pressed heavily. An apartment that felt too quiet, a heart that felt too still. So he found himself driving without intention, pulled not by reason but by something wordless, some H that turned his car toward the road leading to the shelter gates. Inside, the air was thick with sound, the smell of disinfectant cutting sharply against the musk of animals. He walked slowly, his boots echoing across the concrete. Dogs lunged at their cages, tails thrashing, eyes wide with pleas that clawed at the air. Some barked so furiously they sounded hoarse, others pressed their noses through the bars, trembling with eagerness. Each cage was a story, each pair of eyes a question. Will you see me? Will you choose me? The man stopped often, crouching, offering his hand through the bars. Puppies rushed forward in a tumble of fur, tongues frantic against his skin. A shepherd mix barked and spun in circles, desperate to be noticed. He smiled faintly, but his chest did not stir with the certainty he expected. It was as if he were searching for something that wasn't here, though he could not have said what. Then his boots slowed. His gaze shifted. At the far end of the row, half hidden in shadow, lay the dog, thin, unmoving, eyes dulled by exhaustion but still locked on the world as if it might vanish at any second. He did not leap forward. He did not whimper. He only stared, a quiet, steady gaze that seemed to reach beyond the bars, beyond the noise, beyond even the stranger himself. The man felt his steps falter. His chest tightened, a flicker of recognition rising inside him like a forgotten memory. It wasn't beauty that stopped him. This dog's body was frail, patchy, a map of hunger written across his skin. It wasn't energy. The dog barely moved. What struck him was silence. In a world filled with noise, this animal's stillness cut deeper than any bark. It was the kind of silence that asked not to be entertained, not to be adored, but to simply be seen. He crouched slowly, knees pressing against the cold floor. The dog's ears twitched, wary but not retreating. Their eyes met. For a moment, the man felt as if he had stumbled into a mirror. The same heaviness lived in those eyes, the same quiet resignation. He whispered a wordless greeting, voice soft, barely audible over the hum of the lights. The dog blinked. A flicker. Not hope, not yet, but something stirring beneath the surface. He extended his hand toward the bars, not close enough to touch, only near enough to offer. The dog's nose lifted slightly, nostrils flaring. A pause, a hesitation, then slowly, cautiously the dog shifted forward. His movements were unsteady, ribs shifting with each shallow breath, but his eyes never left the stranger's face. Inch by inch, he came closer, until the faint warmth of his breath brushed across the man's fingers. The man stayed still, resisting the urge to rush. He knew instinctively that any sudden movement might break this fragile thread. When the dog's muzzle finally touched his hand, it was not with the urgency of affection, but with the cautious weight of trust half remembered. A tremor ran through the dog's body, as if the act itself carried the burden of a lifetime. The man swallowed, his throat tight. He whispered again, words tumbling without thought. "Hey, I see you." The dog's ears tilted, not in comprehension of language but of tone. Something softened in his gaze, the edges of despair loosening, if only by a fraction. Behind them, the world carried on. A child laughed in another row, a staff member called instructions. A puppy barked relentlessly for attention. But in that small pocket of the corridor, time bent inward, holding only the man and the dog in a fragile silence. A staff worker approached, clipboard in hand, glancing down the row. Her expression shifted when she saw where the man knelt. She sighed softly, a sound heavy with familiarity and sorrow. "That one," she began, then hesitated. "He's not easy. He's scheduled." The words hung like iron in the air. The man looked up, confusion knitting his brow. "Scheduled." Her eyes dropped to the clipboard. "Tomorrow morning. He's been here too long. No one's shown interest." Her voice softened, as though trying to ease the blow. "He's sick. Malnourished. He won't be an easy save." The man looked back at the dog, at the frail body pressed so cautiously against his hand. The dog's eyes had not shifted, still locked with his, as though the truth of his fate did not matter as long as this moment lingered. The man felt something break open inside him. Not pity, not yet decision, but a deep ache that whispered this could not be the end. The worker cleared her throat, shifting uneasily. "You should look at the others. Healthier dogs, easier fits, that one." She trailed off, unwilling to finish. But the man did not move. His knees ached against the concrete. His hand tingled beneath the faint breath of the dog's muzzle, but he remained. For reasons he could not explain, his heart had found its pause, its reason to stop in a hallway filled with 100 other cries. The dog shifted ever so slightly, pressing his nose more firmly against the man's fingers. It was not desperation, it was acknowledgement, as if to say, "If you leave, I will understand. But for this moment, I see you too." The man's eyes stung. He blinked quickly, swallowing words he could not shape. He rose slowly to his feet, the pause stretching into something heavy. The clipboard with the red slash hung clear in his mind, a sentence waiting to be carried out. He looked back once more before turning. The dog remained at the bars, silent, still but no longer entirely hollow. A thread had been tied, invisible, fragile, but strong enough to pull. As he walked away, the sound of his own footsteps felt unbearably loud. The night after he left the shelter, sleep did not come easily. The stranger lay awake in the quiet of his apartment, staring at the ceiling as the city beyond his window moved through its restless rhythm. The hum of distant traffic, the wail of a siren, the occasional clatter of footsteps in the stairwell. Life continued all around him, but within his walls, silence thickened. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the ribs, not soothing but suffocating. He closed his eyes and tried to shake the image. But it returned with brutal clarity. Those eyes, hollow yet unwavering, looking back at him through the bars. Not pleading, not demanding, only asking to be seen. It was not a look one could forget. It clung to him, even in the darkness, even in the space between dreams. He turned on his side, but still the dog's gaze was there. He pressed a pillow over his head, but still he heard the faint echo of a breath against his fingers. Morning came grey and heavy. He poured coffee, but its bitterness tasted hollow. He left his mug half full, pacing the small space of his living room. He glanced at his own life, the stacks of unopened mail, the thin curtains swaying against a draught, the walls painted in neutral shades. Everything seemed muted, as though color itself had abandoned him. And into that emptiness, the image of the dog entered again, a single flame flickering in the haze. By noon, he found himself back in the car, though he had promised himself he wouldn't go. He told himself he was only checking, only confirming what the worker had said, that the dog's time had nearly run out. The rational voice in his head reminded him of the costs, medical bills, long nights, the possibility of heartbreak. He was not wealthy, not experienced, not prepared. But the deeper voice, the one buried beneath reason, whispered, "What if you are his only chance?" The shelter looked different in daylight. Sunlight spilled across the parking lot, but it did not chase away the weight that pressed against the building. Inside, the same chorus of barks rose, echoing against concrete. The same smell of bleach, the same metallic clang of cages. But he walked differently this time, not aimlessly, not wandering, but with a pull guiding his steps down the corridor. The dog was still there, curled on his blanket, eyes half-lidded, body a fragile shadow. When the stranger approached, the dog lifted his head with effort, blinking slowly, as if to confirm the moment was not a dream. Their eyes met again, and in that instant, the stranger felt the argument inside him collapse. Logic, fear, uncertainty, they all fell silent before that gaze. The staff worker noticed him lingering again. Her expression shifted, wary, almost pleading. "You came back," she said quietly, clipboard clutched against her chest. He nodded, though his throat was tight. I can't stop thinking about him." She hesitated, then lowered her eyes. "I need to be honest with you. He's underweight. He has an infection we've been treating, but it's slow. He doesn't eat much, he doesn't play. He might not make it, even if you take him." She sighed. "You'd be taking on a heartbreak waiting to happen." Her words were not unkind. They were meant as protection, as if she was shielding him from the she had seen unfold countless times before. But even as she spoke, the dog pushed his muzzle faintly against the bars. Not in demand, but in acknowledgement of his presence. The man crouched again, pressing his hand to the cold steel. The dog's nose touched his fingers, weaker than yesterday, but still deliberate. The stranger's chest ached. He whispered, almost to himself, "What if he just needs someone to try?" The worker's eyes softened, though sadness lingered. "Then it's a fight you'll have to give everything to. He won't survive halfway." The man looked back at the dog. He thought of his own lived life. The muted walls, the silence, the weight of days blurring together. What had he been surviving for, if not for something that asked him to give more? He exhaled shakily, his decision forming not with thunder, but with quiet inevitability. The clipboard was handed to him. The pen felt heavier than it should. His hand trembled as he signed, each letter carving through hesitation, through fear, through the countless reasons not to. When the final stroke was made, the worker exhaled, a sound half relief, half sorrow. "Well, get him ready." The cage door creaked open. For the first time in months, the dog stepped beyond the bars. His legs wobbled, thin and uncertain. But he moved forward, head low, eyes never leaving the stranger. The leash was clipped gently to his collar, though he hardly resisted. It was not freedom yet, not fully, but it was possibility. The man knelt, meeting him halfway. The dog pressed his head faintly against the stranger's knee, a gesture so fragile it felt like glass in the palm of his hand. The man's throat closed, tears burning his eyes. He reached out, fingers brushing against the coarse fur, whispering again, "I see you, and I'm not leaving." The dog closed his eyes, leaning just slightly into the touch. It was not surrender, not yet trust, but the first step of something greater. The corridor around them blurred. The barking, the workers, the hum of lights, all fading into the background. In that moment, only the two of them remained, a man who had carried silence too long, and a dog who had lived in it even longer. And in that fragile pause, both began to realize. Choice, once made, carries the weight not only of risk but of salvation. The first night at home was not gentle. The stranger carried the dog into his apartment, cradling the frail body against his chest as though it might shatter. The dog did not resist. He simply lay limp, his head pressed weakly against the man's arm. The door closed behind them with a final click, and suddenly the noise of the shelter was gone, replaced by a silence that rang with possibility and fear. The man had prepared as best he could. A soft blanket was spread across the corner of the living room, a bowl of water placed nearby, a small dish of food waiting. But when he set the dog down, the animal only sank onto the blanket, curling in on himself, eyes half closed. He did not touch the food. He barely sniffed the water. His breathing was shallow, his body trembling with exhaustion. The man sat nearby on the floor, cross-legged, unsure of what to do with his hands. He wanted to reach out, to hold, to comfort. But instinct told him patience was the only language the dog might understand. So he stayed still, speaking only in a low murmur. Words meant not for meaning but for tone. "You're safe now. You're home. No one's going to hurt you here." Hours passed like that. The man's back ached. His legs went numb, but he did not move. Outside, the city dimmed into night, streetlights spilling weak pools of amber through the thin curtains. Inside, time hung heavy, broken only by the sound of shallow breaths. At last, the man leaned his head against the wall and drifted into a restless half-sleep. When he woke at dawn, the food remained untouched, the water barely rippled. The dog had not moved. The days that followed were slow, measured in increments so small they felt invisible. The man carried bowls closer, coaxed gently, offered morsels from his hand. Sometimes the dog sniffed, sometimes he turned away. When he did eat, it was a mouthful at most, swallowed with effort. Nights were worse. Bouts of trembling, soft whimpers that escaped unbidden, as though old ghosts still prowled in his dreams. The man would wake, heart racing, and sit close, whispering through the dark until the trembling eased. There were setbacks. One morning, the dog vomited the little food he had eaten. Another day, he collapsed trying to stand, his legs too weak to carry him. The man rushed forward each time, panic clawing at his chest, but the vet reassured him. Recovery was not a straight road. Healing was crooked, jagged, often cruel in its patience. And so he learned to measure progress differently. A flick of the dog's tail when he returned from work. A soft sigh as the dog allowed him to brush matted fur. The first time the dog drank water on his own. These moments were small, fragile as glass, but they burned like lanterns in the stranger's chest. One evening, weeks into their shared life, the man sat again on the floor beside the blanket. His hand rested near but not on the dog. For a long while, nothing happened. Then, slowly, cautiously, the dog shifted forward. His paw, thin and trembling, pressed lightly against the man's knee. It was not a plea, not a command. Only a touch, tentative and deliberate. The man's breath caught. Tears welled unbidden. He placed his hand gently over the paw, not gripping, only resting. And in that fragile gesture, something cracked open between them. Trust did not arrive like thunder. It seeped in like dawn, unnoticed at first, then undeniable. The dog began to follow him from room to room, still distant but present. He watched as the man cooked, as he read, as he sat quietly. He began to eat more, his body filling out with cautious strength. And one morning, when the man returned from the store, the dog greeted him not with stillness, but with the faint wag of a tail. The movement was clumsy, uneven, but it was there. The man laughed aloud, a sound that startled even himself, and knelt to bury his face in the dog's rough fur, whispering through tears, "You're coming back to me? You're coming back." There were still hard nights. Times when the dog's ribs heaved with shallow breaths, when fear returned like a shadow across his eyes. But the man learned to meet each fear with patience, each setback with gentleness. He discovered that love was not grand or effortless. Love was sitting in the dark with another soul and refusing to leave. Weeks turned into months. The dog's coat grew shinier, his step steadier. The man began to take him on short walks, the leash loose, the pace slow. At first, the dog hesitated at every sound. A car door slamming, a stranger's footsteps, the rustle of leaves. But with each walk, his courage stretched further. He sniffed grass. He paused to feel the wind lift against his ears. He even stopped once to watch children playing across the street, his eyes reflecting a light that had long been absent. The man watched too, a strange fullness in his chest. He realized that in giving the dog a chance at life, he himself was learning to live again. The silence of his apartment no longer felt suffocating, it felt shared. The walls no longer muted, but softened by presence. The days no longer hollow, but marked by small, luminous moments. One night, as he sat on the couch reading, the dog approached. Without hesitation this time, he climbed clumsily onto the cushion and curled beside him, head resting against his leg. The man froze, tears stinging his eyes. He closed the book, placed his hand gently on the dog's back, and simply breathed with him. For the first time in years, he felt whole. The road had been long, the steps uneven, the progress fragile. But in the quiet rhythm of a dog's steady breathing, the man understood they were not merely surviving anymore. They were healing, together. The morning of their first true walk together arrived almost without announcement. The man woke before the alarm, drawn from sleep by something lighter than duty, anticipation. The air in the apartment felt different, touched by the cool promise of dawn. When he glanced down at the floor beside his bed, he saw the dog waiting, already sitting upright, thin body stronger now, eyes alert. There was no bark, no rush, only the quiet certainty that today was a day worth meeting. They stepped outside into air that smelled of dew and damp earth. The street was nearly empty, the world still tucked beneath its blankets, but the horizon was blushing with the faintest wash of gold. The leash hung loosely between them, more a ribbon of connection than restraint. The dog walked with a hesitance at first, paws tapping lightly against the pavement, nose lifted as if testing the truth of the new day. The man kept pace, neither urging nor holding back. He let the dog choose the rhythm. They passed the corner store, its windows dark, the scent of fresh bread just beginning to seep through its cracks. They passed a park where grass glistened with morning wetness, each blade catching the early light like glass. When they reached the open stretch of field beyond, the man paused, crouching low. He looked at the dog, at the body that had once been too weak to stand, at the eyes that had once carried nothing but resignation. Now they shimmered with something else, something fragile but undeniable. He unclipped the leash, his heart tightening in his chest. For a moment, the dog stood still, as if unsure of the permission just given. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. And then he ran. The movement was awkward at first, his legs not yet used to freedom, but within moments it smoothed into something fluid, something that felt like memory restored. He darted across the grass, ears catching the wind, tail unfurling in a wild, uneven wag. The man watched, his throat closing, his eyes blurring. It was not just running, it was reclamation, the act of life seizing itself again. The sun lifted higher, spilling light across the field, painting the dog in hues of gold. Each stride seemed to carve away the shadows that had clung to him. He was not the frail body on the blanket anymore. He was not the red slash on a clipboard. He was not the silence in a cage. He was alive, uncontained, written anew in every breath. The man sank onto the grass, knees damp with dew, laughter breaking from his chest in unsteady bursts. He covered his mouth with his hand, tears spilling anyway, overwhelmed by the sheer enormity of the sight before him. For so long he had carried silence inside him, convinced his life would remain muted. But here, in the simple act of a dog's freedom, he felt something awaken. The dog circled back, tongue lolling, chest heaving with the effort of joy. He slowed, padding toward the man, and without hesitation pressed his body against him, head buried into his chest. The man wrapped his arms around the fragile but strengthening frame, holding on as though anchoring himself to the moment. The world could have ended then, and it would have ended complete. They stayed there until the sun climbed fully, until the chill lifted and warmth spread across the field. The dog lay beside him now, stretched in the grass, eyes half-lidded in peace. The man leaned back on his hands, face lifted to the light. Around them, the city stirred awake, but within their small circle, time seemed to pause, holding them safe. In that stillness, he understood what he had not been able to name before. He had thought he was rescuing the dog. He had thought he was saving him from silence, from hunger, from the shadow of death. But in truth, the dog had rescued him as well, pulled him out of a life that had grown numb, given him a reason to rise in the morning, a heartbeat to measure his own against. The clipboard with its red slash belonged to another world now, one they had both left behind. Ahead stretched something unmarked, unwritten, fragile but infinite. Not perfect, not certain, but alive. That night, when the day had folded into dusk again, they returned home. The dog curled at his feet, body rising and falling in the rhythm of sleep. The man sat still, unwilling to disturb the quiet. Light from the window painted the floor in fading gold, and for the first time, the apartment did not feel empty. It felt like it had a center, a gravity, a pulse. He reached down, brushing his hand lightly along the dog's back, and whispered into the half-dark, "You're home. Forever?" The dog stirred faintly, a soft sigh escaping, and nestled closer. The man closed his eyes, letting the silence settle. It no longer suffocated. It no longer weighed. It simply held them, two souls once marked for endings, now folded into the gentle permanence of beginning again. And as the last threads of daylight slipped away, the world narrowed to one image: a dog safe in sleep, the rise and fall of breath steady, the future unwritten but promised in every inhale. A life once counted down had become a life counted on, and in that quiet, unremarkable room, forever had already begun.